take your seats now. The forum will begin in a few minutes. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Trey Grayson. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and I want to welcome everybody here this evening to our discussion, Partisanship and Gridlock in Congress. Can we make democracy work? But before we begin the panel discussion tonight, the Kennedy School today suffered a loss. One of our longtime employees and good friends, Jane Latcham, who's been with the executive education programs here for many, many years, tragically passed away today. And if possible, I'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence in Jane's memory. And think of her family and friends, if you would. Okay, thank you for that. It's been a tough day for her, especially for her coworkers. Tonight, we're really pleased to have Drew Faust, the 28th president of Harvard University, the Lincoln Professor of History at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, to give an introduction and welcome us to the forum tonight and to frame the discussion before handing it over to our moderator and our panelists. So please join me in welcoming President Faust.
Thank you, Trey, and thank you to our panelists in advance. I thought it was so important to try to ask and answer the questions that these panelists are going to address with us tonight, because I think we all are searching for answers. In the first 16 days of last month, as I know you all remember, with Congress having failed to pass a new budget or extend the one in place, the federal government shut down. Government services, national parks, programs around the country ground to a halt. More than 750,000 federal employees were furloughed, and 1.3 million workers were required to report to work, but with no guarantee of whether and when they'd get paid. Around the world, people looked at us and scratched their heads and began to wonder about the United States. Is the American experiment unraveling? Is the US dollar a reliable global currency? One columnist pondered whether or not the United States had become a failed state. Here at home, people got angry. They needed to know they could rely on air traffic controllers, nursing home reimbursements, highway repairs, border control posts. They needed their government to work. Now that seems to me a pretty reasonable request, a working government. Yet despite the agreement that led to a reopening of the government, deep divisions in our politics and in our ability to work together for the common good remain. Deep divisions are not new to our government. Washington Post columnist and Harvard alum E.J. Dionne describes the United States as conceived in argument. But for nearly 2.5 centuries, we've most of the time, I'm a Civil War historian, so I know when we haven't figured out how to govern while arguing, but most of the time we figured out how to compromise, how to find common ground. You think of these pairings that have become legendary, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, Russ Feingold and John McCain. These people all knew that reaching across the aisle, giving some, getting some, winning some, losing some, was essential and was the way things actually got done. For most of our history, policymaking has been understood to be a process that requires compromise, that requires the accommodations of other points of view. Compromise has often been seen as a virtue, not as a sign of weakness. What has changed? Our panel tonight is going to help us to understand whether things have changed, whether they've changed for good, whether they can change back, and what we all can do about it. And I look forward to this very much. I also am especially delighted to be able to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel. There is no better person to serve us in this role than my friend Karen Gordon-Mills. She is an IOP fellow at the moment, and we are delighted to have her here at Harvard. And she has engaged citizens in the work of getting things done, creating opportunities for success in a variety of roles. Most recently, she has been the administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration, where more than 193,000 businesses received help under her administration, help amounting to more than $100 billion, a figure that is matched only by her ability and commitment to enabling individuals from wide range of backgrounds to take part in the innovation economy. She worked successfully at the SBA with both Democrats and Republicans to promote small business and to encourage the growth of our economy. And she knows very well how to move people and prosperity forward. I'm also proud to say that she is a graduate of Harvard College and of Harvard Business School, and that she is a former vice chair of our governing board, the Board of Overseers. So let me turn this over to her able hands. Karen, thank you so much for being here and doing this. Karen.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here, and many, many thanks to President Faust for convening us. I asked her just before in the green room, what would you like to accomplish tonight? And she said, well, it would be nice if you could solve the problem. So, panel, we have our work cut out for us. Now, luckily, the president put together a fantastic panel to bring us insight and perhaps solutions. And I'm going to not introduce them fully because you've got the long bio in your notes, but you might want to know just a couple things about Professor Alex Keyssar, who is at the end here. Not only is he a historian of many things we're going to talk about today, but also has written on maritime history, being from the state of Maine, I appreciate that, the history of science and technology, and he is a screenwriter, so he might do a treatment for TV on what's going on in Congress to follow the already successful House of Cards, right? Now, we have a second academic point of view here. Professor Theda Skocpol, known to many of you, and particularly well known to my liaisons at the Institute of Politics who have tutored me in her work. But what you don't know about the professor is that she is an expert on football. And I am going to ask her about my fantasy football team after this because I need a new running back. Secretary Solis, I had the great honor of serving with the Secretary in the President's cabinet. We have shared many girls' dinner. The girls of the cabinet had dinner together every month or so. And we also shared many initiatives. And she is my colleague and friend, but she is also here because she spent 8 years in Congress and can bring us the insight of a sitting congressperson and also somebody who is running for an office, another statewide office, I guess it is, back in, or district office back in her home area of Los Angeles. And then, without his hat, or maybe with his hat, the famous Mark McKinnon, who many of us see on TV often. But Mark, you are here also in your role as the head of No Labels. And you're going to talk a little bit, I think, about that with us. But Mark is also a songwriter, as many of you know. So we have a screenwriter and a songwriter. I think we're going to be just fine. So before we make music, let me begin with one thought, which is apparently back in the day, George Washington said to Thomas Jefferson that it was expected that Congress was going to be contentious, and that, in fact, he said we need to pour our legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it, because the expectation was that it would bubble and overflow and be overheated in the House and then be poured into the Senate, where it would become cool and things would get done. And perhaps today, this isn't happening so much. Alex, maybe you might begin by giving us a historical perspective. Are we more divided today than in the past? And have there been some historical moments when the parties have shut down government before or had as much contentious behavior?
The answer to those questions is simply yes. There have been moments in the past. I mean, as President Faust mentioned, we did have a civil war. And you can think of that as a government shutdown, and a lot else.
The country shut down.
Yeah, right. And 750,000 people died as a result of that shutdown. So, yeah, and there are other moments as well. I mean, in the early years of the Republic, after the 1800 election, I mean, we think of the founding fathers as this group of collective wise men who deliberated together, and some of them really hated each other by the early 19th century. And we have to remember, in 1804, a sitting vice president shot and killed the former Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, another sign of sharp divisions, I would say. The partisan acrimony of that period is notable. I think the other period that's worth our thinking about, which doesn't involve splits in Congress so much, is the 1930s, when there was something of a threatened paralysis of government itself because of the Supreme Court's willingness to throw out any legislation that was passed that might possibly do something to ameliorate the Great Depression. Now, what I just want to say at the outset, I don't want to go on too long, is that I don't think what we should take from that is simply, well, we've had these problems in the past, it'll be okay. I mean, the question is, what can we learn from that? I mean, one thing we learn is that those moments were moments when there was a whole lot at stake, and there were really, really severe disagreements about policy, and disagreements that didn't seem to some people to be bridgeable or compromisable. It would almost be a betrayal of your principles to compromise. And I think that is something like what we are seeing today, where I think the overarching issue going on right now is whether the role of the federal government in domestic policy, which there's been a broad consensus about for the last 80 years, that it would be to protect against excesses of private power, regulate markets within some limits, encourage equality, encourage democracy, and protect the least well-off members of the society. I think the question is whether that role of government, of the federal government, is going to continue, and it's perceived with great urgency. Now, the one last thing I would add as a question is, there certainly are other factors in the political culture and other things that we'll talk about that somehow seem to be making it impossible to compromise over those severe substantive issues.
Well, and that's where we'll go next with Professor Skocpol here. What's going on with the Tea Party? Now, the professor has written about the Tea Party, gone out in this country and talked to many, many, many voices, been in the room with folks in the Tea Party, but 38% of Republicans consider themselves part of the Tea Party movement, and in some polls that's even higher. Why does this group have such tremendous appeal? What's going on? And how significant are the divisions in the Republican Party?
Well, they're very significant. I think that we talk a lot about polarization in Congress and in the society, and there is a fair amount of disagreement about the issues that Professor Keyssar identified. But the poll is sharper to the right on the side of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party right now is very deeply divided at all levels, from elites to ordinary voters who tell national survey researchers that they think of themselves as Republicans. My colleague Vanessa Williamson and I were puzzled about the Tea Party, and we went out and observed meetings and sat down for quiet one-on-one interviews with grassroots Tea Partiers in several parts of the country. And what we heard when we talked to people one-on-one was middle-class Americans, older white people, conservative-minded to be sure, but also quite angry and fearful about the changes that they think are taking their country away from them at this moment. Partly, it's something that happens anytime a president comes to power with co-partisans in Congress, which happened in 2008. The other party reacts. But it had a harder edge to it this time because Barack Obama was seen as championing changes that appealed to younger Americans, that would, as he put it, build an economy from the middle and bottom up rather than the top down, and which many grassroots Tea Partiers saw as threatening their hard-won livelihoods and Medicare, Social Security, veterans benefits that they felt they had earned as hardworking Americans. On top of that, you have some pretty well-resourced ideological groups that are willing to send money around to challenge Republican office holders and Republican candidates for Congress and state legislatures who dare to compromise. Compromise becomes a dirty word and evil in this portion of the Republican Party. And I want to stress that it's not all Republicans. Actually, the last shutdown that we saw, 80% of Americans were opposed to it. And if you go out and go through the country and listen to what people are saying, you hear anger from people of many partisan persuasions about that. But from the point of view of the grassroots people who are good citizens who turn out in Republican primaries and vote against compromisers with the hated Barack Obama and with Democrats, and of the roving billionaire ultra-free market ideologues who send money into Republican primaries, compromise is something that they don't want to see, and they were prepared to go all the way to an unpopular government shutdown to prevent it. Will this end? We'll talk about that, but my short answer is it's not ending quickly because the leverage on the Republican Party does not depend on general popularity. It depends on the sense that one doesn't want to be challenged from the right. And the forces at work are pretty determined to tough out budget battles and policy battles for the next several years.
Well, Mark, I'm going to skip to you for a second. So where do we go from here? You co-founded a group, No Labels. It is gaining some traction, you told me. Can we achieve a government that works? Can we find a way to bring people together to make this kind of compromise?
Well, the tunnel's dark, but there is light. About 3 years ago, in response to what we were seeing in Washington, there's an enormous energy that you all see in your communities and we saw outside of Washington. An anger and a frustration about the fact that whether your friends and neighbors were Republicans or Democrats, and sometimes strong Democrats or strong Republicans, to a person, almost all of them said, yeah, I have strong political feelings and passions, but I think Washington's got to work. I mean, we've got significant policy issues that we face right now that are affecting all of us, our quality of life, our children's future, and so there's got to be give somewhere. And the problem, as the professors have pointed out to, which we could talk about for hours, but among those problems are a system today that's different than it was a long time ago, which rewards bad behavior. In other words, because of Citizens United and the funding of these other groups, you have a system that by which somebody coined the term profit for purity recently, which I thought was perfect. But you have these groups of consultants like me and my old hat who go out and make money by punishing people for good behavior. And so what we said was there's nothing out there rewarding people for good behavior. And so the idea broadly was that we would try and cast a net around the country and bring some of this energy from outside of Washington to reinforce what we would describe as adult good behavior. And it's been a very interesting exercise, and I just want to kind of briefly describe the arc because I think it's important to understanding where we go from here, because we've learned a lot. At first, what we thought, and what I thought specifically, was there's not enough representation in the middle, and that we need to and for lots of reasons, because of redistricting and things, we've lost kind of representation in the middle and the moderates, progressives, what have you. And so we thought we would sort of represent that voice that was missing. Quickly discovered that that was not very productive. One, you get 1,000 people in a room and asking what their idea of a centrist is, you'll get 1,000 different ideas about what that is. Two, we discovered that the country is polarized. It's not just Congress, but so is the country. As we become more mobile and can move around, people are living in like communities. And so the country itself is more polarized. And so then we said, okay, well, then perhaps we need to address the systemic problems that are creating. Again, we could talk for an hour about those things, but it's things like redistricting reforms and campaign finance reforms and electoral reforms, primary reforms, those sort of things. Interesting experiments going on out there, and there's some good news there too. But we said other people are doing that. That's going to take a long time to happen. We want to try and achieve more instant results. And so what we decided to do was to focus our attention on trying to build trust in the Congress. We said we can't just be outside Congress. We have to get Congress to buy into this. So we did a lot of work over the last 3 years, working with chiefs of staffs, working with members about trying to find a way in which we could kind of, I describe Washington as currently as a place where people are shoveling sand into the engine of government, just shutting it down. And so we're trying to get in there, clean it up, find a place where we can put some oil in it, just to get the engine moving again, not necessarily talking about a destination, but just where people can trust one another again, because as you know, it's gotten so highly polarized that many Republicans, Senator Joe Manchin was a good example. I talked to him a couple, he said, I've been in the Senate 2 years, I've never had a meeting with a Republican. I never any kind of formal meeting. And so we said, well, that's got to change. And so what we decided to do was first of all, bring pressure from now over 500,000 members that we have that represent every Senate district in the country. And then we came out with a bunch of ideas that aren't really left or right. They're not Democratic or Republican, not obviously. They're more kind of what I call process issues that don't have an ideological tinge to them. And then we said we want members of Congress to join what we call the No Labels Problem Solvers Coalition. We announced that in January. Our goal was that we had 20 people come out when we announced it. We hoped that we could get to 50. The leadership on both sides kind of patted us on the head and said, that's very nice, come back to us when you get 70. Well, I'm happy today to announce that we have 87 members of the United States Congress, half Republicans, half Democrats, who have joined this caucus, who have found it so productive and rewarding. We wanted them to meet once a month, but they're getting such great feedback from their constituents, and they're finding they're actually getting stuff done that they're meeting weekly now. They have, in the last 3 months, developed, written, and filed 17 different pieces of legislation, and they are co-sponsoring that legislation. They're all working on that legislation. And I'll just say, finally, as a note of how this can and does work in real time, one of the ideas that came out of this work that we did collectively was an idea called no budget, no pay, which was as simple as it sounds. The idea is that if the Congress doesn't do their job, which is to write a budget, primarily that's their job because that's the blueprint for their job, just as it is for a business. We said if you don't put forward a budget, and at that point the Senate hadn't put forward a budget since the introduction of the iPad, and that was just last spring. And so we said, and this was an enormously popular idea, especially outside of Washington, not so popular inside Washington, but as evidence of the traction that we can get, that idea, as you may recall, became the short-term solution to the last debt ceiling crisis in the spring, where that helped kind of break the floodgates, and they said if the Senate will pass a budget, we'll extend the ceiling, and that's what happened. So the idea is that we would extend that more broadly to the entire budgeting and appropriations process. But it's way beyond my expectations. I had really hoped to get to 50 this year. People are doing it, and they are finding such a great reaction from their constituents that now instead of trying to get to 50, the thing that we're talking about now is maybe we need to cap this at some point, because at some point maybe we have so many members that doesn't have that much meaning, but we're not going to do that. I'm happy to have as many as we can.
That's
But anyway,
50 out of 400 and 500, yeah.
Yeah, 435, yeah.
Right. So last question for Hilda. You were in the Congress, and you said to me that when you were there, it was much more collegial, and now we were reminiscing about some of the times we went up to testify, which were a lot less collegial. But what do you think about Congress now versus then, and what do you think about the demographic changes that you are very much engaged in and have been engaged in? How do you think that that is going to influence the issue, the gridlock we have today?
Well, when I did serve in the House, it was for 8 years, between 2000 and 2009. And obviously, there were more opportunities to interact across the aisle. And in fact, I remember one of my first committee assignments was on education and workforce. And the chair of the committee was Mr. Boehner. And we had a very good relationship, you know, friendly, talkative. We couldn't always win on every issue, but there was compromise. We could even work out language. I remember even disputing an amendment that he wanted to propose to committees and a subcommittee that it would be established. And I worked very hard with other members to see if we could overturn or change it and modify it, and we did. And it came out to everyone's benefit, including his party. So, I mean, at that time, there was that kind of compromise. It's since changed. I don't think there's a lot of time being spent with members across the aisle like we used to. We used to have, even in our own delegation in California, one of the largest delegations, where you'd have Republicans and Democrats get together. That doesn't happen anymore that I know of. And I know that when I came to the cabinet, it was as though friends that I had in the House on both sides, more so on the other side of the aisle, would treat me very differently. Or in front of people, they would treat me very differently. Behind closed doors, hi Hilda, how are you doing? But then in committee, if it was an oversight committee in particular, boy, the spears came out and the daggers. And it was very, very unsettling. But I try to control myself and try to conduct myself in a respectful manner and to be respectful to the members, because that's really what it's about.
Well, you know, we see this quite a bit, and maybe it's just the media's fault. And I want you to all jump in on this. I mean, maybe it's just, you know, that the media can't seem to, be unbiased. Maybe it's because we're all watching too much cable TV. And I've had folks talk about new media, and that new media sort of should be democratizing the discussion and letting more voices in. But instead, people have commented that the new media, Twitter, takes away the fact base and doesn't allow a conversation, a reader to know, is this really factual? And so that the media has become part of the problem, not as much part of the solution. So I want you to jump in on this, as you please.
Well, I'll take a quick shot at it first. There's a lot of components to this that I think are relevant. I'm often asked, and I see discussions about, is the media biased left or right? And that's an interesting conversation, but I don't think it's particularly relevant in the sense that it's anything we're going to do much about, or that it's even problematic. What is more problematic is that there is an inherent bias toward friction and train wrecks, and so the media generally is not going to go out and write everybody's getting along together. Isn't that a great story? They love food fights. And just as an anecdote, because I think this perfectly illustrates how difficult it is. I was doing a television show that's with a show that I'm sure you've all seen with a well-known host. And we were talking about bipartisanship and some solutions and no label, that sort of thing. This is exactly what we're talking about. We went to the break, and when it went to break, he turned to me and said, "Can we just cut the bipartisan crap and throw some red meat?" So that's the kind of environment we're dealing with.
Yeah, nobody wants the positive story. Other thoughts?
You know, the media has changed, but let's keep this in a little bit of perspective. In 19th century America, the media was frankly partisan. What's different now is that it's frankly partisan in a uneven way, in the sense that the people who spend a lot of time watching television and who, according to the best research, tend to get their ideas about what's going on the conservative side of the spectrum, have self-reinforcing media. Everybody else is kind of scattered around and actually not paying much attention to political news. As recently as the 1960s, the TV was on at dinner time, and there were 3 versions of exactly the same thing. I remember that. There was CBS, ABC, and NBC. And NBC was a tweak more liberal than the other two. But now you can either watch interpretive news and shouting that reinforces what you already feel, and I think feel is a good word for it, or you can ignore it altogether, which more and more Americans are doing. They're just dropping out and turning it off. And I will agree with Mark McKinnon on one thing. I think that the media in general rewards obstreperous behavior. That's why Ted Cruz won in the last episode. The country as a whole is turned off, angry. That's pretty much bipartisan because close to a majority of Republicans are also upset about what happened in October. But Ted Cruz is delighted. And why shouldn't he be? He now has perfect name recognition on the Tea Party right of the Republican Party, which is crucial in the upcoming presidential primaries, and he has 90% approval among those folks. So it's rewarding for certain kinds of actors to do the kind of, he was the general who remarkably reached across and even got House members. That's almost unheard of for House members and Senate members to cooperate, isn't it? He directed them more than John Boehner was able to direct them in this recent episode, and he's come out a winner.
He's the winner. So let's look at the economic side of this. How much, maybe nobody's paying attention, but maybe they shouldn't pay attention because how much is this really damaging the country? And so I'll be a little provocative and say, you know, if you look at the GDP numbers, they were better than expected, 2.8. If you look at the jobs numbers, better than expected, over 200,000, and the past 2 quarters were revised upward. If you look at the stock market, up, up, up. So what is happening? You know, is this really affecting our economy? Now, you could argue perhaps confidence is down. The fear of uncertainty, certainly in the small business optimism, it's down and it's being affected. And our international image is being affected. So does this matter? Is it?
I think the real answer to that is we don't know yet. It's really too soon. I mean, and I think that it's a mistake to try to look at short-term indicators to think about what kind of impact that it's going to have. I mean, and you know, I think that what we have in the gridlock we're seeing is a reluctance to confront problems. A real reluctance to confront problems, and that can pose some real trouble down the road, even if the indicators right now, I mean, so the job numbers are sort of okay, although there's an awful lot of people who've been unemployed for an awful long time and who are not getting unemployment insurance benefits anymore, so I'm not sure how okay that is.
Yeah,
But can I throw something out? Even though people are maybe tuning out a bit, and I somewhat agree with that, I do know that, for example, on immigration reform, that there are a whole host of people, Republicans, business folks, that really want to see something happen. They even have the number of votes there, but leadership won't allow it, or the top tier that are run by, say, some of the Tea Party folks don't want to see it. And that would benefit our economy, put people to work, people would be paying taxes, a whole slew of things could happen. We could lower the deficit. But rational minds are not being rational, or those voices aren't being heard, and I get frustrated too, because many times I hear it from regular people that they want to see things done. They know what the solutions are. They know that Congress can do it, but we've got to somehow get their attention.
So how are we going to get their attention? I mean, who is going to lead right now? Is there anybody who could be stepping up?
Well, let me tag on to the last question and bounce to that one. I think those indicators that you mentioned are, I mean, they're encouraging, but I think they're incredibly illusory. I think there are underlying dynamics that are very troubling, and I hear that not just from Republicans, but from very thoughtful Democratic economists who know a whole lot more about any of this than I do, but to a person, none of them are optimistic about the economic future. And I think if you quantified, and some people have, the actual impact of the recent shutdown and a number of other things like the sequester, it's billions and billions and billions of dollars and points on our economic growth, et cetera.
We could be having fuller employment.
Yeah, and so
Absolutely.
one of the encouraging things to me that's I guess bad news, good news out of all of this, and as I look through the lens of what needs to happen in the Republican Party, first of all, there are things that are happening that are encouraging. One is that they are starting to punish these profit for purity companies and entities and take away business from them and blackball them from working in the party. Ted Cruz has actually come out and said that he's not going to work against incumbents now, so the pressure has worked on that. But more to the point, and I think more importantly, the business community is sending a lot of signals of saying we've had it. And by the way, the most encouraging thing that came out of the last election, again for me looking at where the Republican Party needs to go, which was an encouraging sign, is well, there was the election of Chris Christie and the loss of Ken Cuccinelli. That was the big story. The one that was not as reported, but much more important, from my perspective again, was a House race in Alabama.
Exactly.
And that was a race that pitted a Tea Party darling, really a terrific-looking sort of perfect Tea Party candidate on paper, versus a candidate the Chamber of Commerce and the business interests said, we've had it, enough of this, and they put up their own candidate and beat him. And so, in Alabama. So I think there's a shift going on that's important.
Wasn't one of them an incumbent? They both supported the government shutdown, so I mean, before we go overboard.
But one
Baby
was-
steps,
One
baby
was
steps.
slightly more radical, though, right?
I mean, it's astonishing that close to two-thirds of the House Republicans
Vote for the
voted
shutdown.
against lifting the shutdown in the face of 80% public disapproval and 16 days of nothing. Let me just say something about whether it matters. I want to take Secretary Hilda's example of immigration reform. This is an area where there are big problems that face the economy and the business community, and there are human problems, including young people who grew up in this country and deserve to continue to think of themselves as full Americans after they finish K through 12 school. There is overwhelming public support for the kind of grand bargain that, in fact, Democrats and Republicans came together in the Senate to support. That was pretty remarkable, what happened last summer. John Boehner will not bring it to a vote or anything else piecemeal that might go to a conference committee where a compromise could be worked out. Now, I don't think John Boehner is anything but a good old boy, Chamber of Commerce, let's make a deal Republican. But his behavior has changed. That tells us that this is not a problem that can be solved just by getting people in the room to be nice to each other, even though I'm for it. There's something larger going on here, and John Boehner, even with the business community pushing him, will not allow movement at all toward a solution of this problem that this country has been struggling with for more than a decade. And the harm will be both human and economic, and the other kind of harm that comes when our country cannot address pressing problems like full employment, improvement in our way of funding higher education, I could just go down the whole list, is that the population becomes to think that our government and our democracy can't work. And that's a terrible cost, no matter what the unemployment trend is.
Right.
Because it turns off people, particularly young people.
So a couple of quick questions. Is there any leadership, anybody who you believe could step up, Mayor Bloomberg, someone else, and make a difference in this discussion?
Let's start with John Boehner. Let's ask him to step up right now.
Right, and
We
maybe
could-
somebody needs to have his back.
We could send a message and say, we'd like to see that.
Well, the challenge is that, is particularly for the Republicans or any party when they're out of power, is that you have a power vacuum. You don't have an established leader of the party, and that allows other voices, Ted Cruz and others, to fill those pockets and vacuums. And we won't have that voice until we have a Republican nominee. and there's going to be a big struggle between now and then. And I think Michael Bloomberg would be a great candidate for President of the United States. I wish he'd do it. I wish he'd do it as a Republican. I wish he'd do it as an independent. I wish he'd do it as a unicorn. I don't care what. I wish he'd just run. But
There's no chance.
again, I think Chris Christie is the kind of person. I mean, Jeb Bush would be terrific. I mean, there are potentially lots of good candidates out there that could provide that voice.
Any other thoughts about the 2016 election?
You know,
Stay
Mitt
tuned.
Romney was no Tea Partier. But by the time he finished going through the gauntlet of the primary process, he had endorsed every single extreme position.
So you think it's going to, anybody who comes up for the Republican Party is going to need to follow that?
Until moderate Republicans step up and organize and push back, that's what's going to happen.
And I think the business community, because to the point of funding these candidates, and they've been known for doing that for years and years, they have a voice. They can exert that power, and I saw what happened in Alabama. I see it happening in California right now, where there are some members of the Republican Party who are now turning and softening their blows and watching what they're saying about immigration, about a whole slew of issues that typically they didn't have to. They were pretty well set. And now changing demographics and other characteristics are coming into play as well, and they're threatened.
So
They're completely
we are
unpowered.
going to turn it over to questions shortly. But before I do that, I have the lightning round. So I'm going to ask one question and give us a quick answer as people gather their thoughts for the question and answer. I am now the fairy godmother, and I will grant you each one thing that Congress will pass tomorrow. They will pass one bill, whatever it is that you want, that you think could significantly improve this and deliver what President Faust asked us to, the solution for this problem. So what would you ask, Alex? What would you ask Congress to pass?
I'm going to try to give a realistic rather than
I'm the fairy. You've granted
Well,
you a
no,
fairy godmother wish.
I would like them to mandate nonpartisan districting throughout the country.
No, so it's the redistricting question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Supreme Court would overrule that.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but
Right.
Professor Scott.
Okay. Well, I don't think the problem can be solved in Congress, so I have to say that. But if I would like to see Congress act, I would like to see the House pass immigration reform and the Senate pass filibuster reform. Those two things would make a big difference in the short run.
I think I would also like to bifurcate mine. So immigration reform, because we do have Republican buy-in, and also more funding for open space, National Park Service, and climate change activities. We need to see more of that happening. That affects Republican districts. Look what happened in Hurricane Sandy, and people just need to be thinking about how can we find solutions to these issues that are going way beyond our control, but we can somehow address them and plan.
So something that people could come together on,
Yes.
and it would be an example of how to get things done.
Well, I like the redistricting reform. Of course, in California is doing a good experiment on that. I also completely agree on filibuster reform, which is something that we've been advocating. And there's another idea that we've advocated that's along the line of filibuster reform. That's an interesting one, I think, which I forget what we're calling it, but it's basically what you call fast track authority. You give fast track authority to the president every cycle for 3 issues. In other words, the president-elect would decide 3 issues that are his or her priority. And they would get fast track authority, which basically just means all they need is a majority in the House or the Senate to pass it. They don't have to deal with the filibusters and what have you. So that whoever's elected, sort of elections have consequences. If you run on those issues, you get to have an up or down vote on those. It could be immigration reform, whatever it is, say up or down. And I think that would be progressive.
That's a very interesting idea. So now we turn to you, and if you have any ideas for the lightning round, please, feel free to step up as well. The guidelines for the questions: please identify yourself and your affiliation. One brief question, please. No speeches. And my panel set the example on this. Thank you. It was great. End your question with a question mark. So we will begin in the balcony.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Sylvia. I'm a junior at the college. And all of you mentioned how extreme things are right now. Even in Facebook, it seems that social media gives voices to the extremes, not necessarily to the middle, and how people who aren't on the extremes really need to mobilize. But what exactly can we do? We don't have a social media platform. We're not really being listened to by our congressmen and senators. So how exactly do we mobilize and say that enough is enough? Because this has been going on for quite a while, and it seems like us saying it's enough isn't enough.
I gather when you say us, you mean your generation, right? Or are you speaking
People
more?
who are fed up, mostly, who
Yeah.
aren't on the extremes, which
Well, I would say a couple of things. That they are, and I believe we're reaching a tipping point, and I think No Labels is a great example of people responding in a way that is very activist, and they're not just, 10 years ago they may have just said, oh, I'm just going to tune it out. Now they think the issues are too important, and they're engaging, and we're seeing all kinds of evidence of that. I would just also add, in another note, I'm an eternal optimist, but having spent as much time as I could at Harvard, because I'm a serial fellow, I spent a lot
How many
of
fellows, you've been here?
3 times.
Yeah, this is good.
Wow.
So I spent a lot of time around students, and I'm really encouraged by millennials, and because I think that you are, as a group, passionate yet skeptical about what works and what doesn't, and are smart about ways that you are engaging. And this goes to a whole nother issue that really underlies everything we're talking about, which is the broader issue of trust. The bigger problems on the economy, with the government, all these issues relate to a evaporating trust that voters have in government, in the economy, in each other. I mean, that's why a lot of what we're trying to do in No Labels is just getting people in a room and getting them to trust one another again. But the way that millennials are manifesting that is they are, I think because they see the traditional channels haven't worked. So they're not necessarily just going to work on, like at the Democratic National Party or the Republican Campaign Committee. They're very entrepreneurial, looking at NGOs, going to places like No Labels or others that aren't the usual channels to try and promote change. So they're going to NGOs and nonprofits and very entrepreneurial. So that's a kind of a shift that I see that's encouraging, that's going to make the system adapt to them rather than the other way around.
One good example of that was the DREAM Act students. They kind of organically organized across the country through social media, but also just through their own informal networks. And they caught the attention of some folks that really needed to have their attention drawn to the issue. So I think there's different ways, and it goes to CBOs, grassroots organizing, and just collectively looking at non-traditional ways of reaching people.
I'll pass.
Well, I'm not going to pass because non-traditional ways of organizing are fine, and organizing is very important. But I'll tell you, the right to vote in this country is under attack. And that may sound old-fashioned, but actually it isn't. If you look at what's happening in many states across the country, all kinds of obstacles are being put in the way of many groups registering to vote and exercising the right to vote. And it is very important. This is something that I don't think Occupy Wall Street was aware enough of, but the Tea Party activists are. The Tea Party activists are good citizens. You have to organize, you have to speak up, but you also have to vote. And these, at this point, going to have to fight for the right to vote of all Americans in the way that people did when I was young as well, because the right to vote, and Professor Keyssar has written about this, is not permanently won. It can be rolled back, and we're in a period of big rollback.
Can I unpass? Just on this specifically, for example, there is now a movement that, a couple of members of Congress have introduced an amendment to the Constitution to guarantee a federal right to vote. That's something you can organize around. I think, right. I think that one of the things that you and your friends can do is think about what the obstacles are. Think about what it is that's leaving you feeling powerless. And pick one dimension of that you think maybe you can change if you move along.
Well, and where you could reach out to people of other groups. And I think, you know, that the right to vote is much more worth fighting to extend and guarantee than, for example, a quixotic quest to get money out of politics, which will not happen in the lives of my grandchildren even. It's not going to happen.
Hi, my name is Carolyn. I'm a junior here at the college. Thank you so much for speaking here tonight. I'm asking this question on behalf of the Forum Committee. So as was mentioned tonight, parties are fighting not only each other, but also amongst themselves. There are certain factions that want to encourage bipartisanship, that want to encourage compromise, and there are other citizens who want the representatives to stick to their principles and not compromise. What can party leaders do to attempt to heal these divisions within their own parties, or is this a change that simply has to come from the bottom up? Is there nothing leadership can do about this?
Leadership can do something, and I know that even in my caucus, the Democratic caucus, when I was a member, we had divisions. We had what we call blue dogs, you had centrists, and then you had the progressives. I was part of the progressives. And so every now and then, you know, we'd all have to get in the room with the leader, and we'd have an adult talking to us.
Well, there is
Sometimes it
this
takes
issue
that.
about the adult in the room, and this question about leadership. And, you know, we've had other leaders in the past, you know, George Mitchell and, you know, Tip O'Neill and others who have, Newt Gingrich, you know, who provide a certain level of, you know, gravitas to these discussions. Is there somebody who could rise up?
And I don't think it's true that Democrats are not willing to compromise. I mean, the opinion polls show that Democrats and independents and non-Tea Party Republicans all believe in compromise. And political scientists actually have quantitative measures for these things. And there's a broader tent right now in the Democratic Party, and members of that fairly broad tent actually work things out and are willing often to engage in compromise, and have, I think, quite often in the last few years made the first move.
And we had some idea about rewarding good behavior.
Well,
right,
I push back on that just a little bit, but
Okay.
because I think that there may maybe not the exact same numbers, but the same sort of moneyed interests are applying the same sort of pressures on the left, and the pressures are not to compromise on entitlement reforms and all kinds of things on the left, where you have lots of progressives that are locking in on no compromise on Social Security entitlement, no compromise. So it's not just dedicated to one side or the other. To your question, I would say that it's just remarkable. It sounds so simple, the impact that just knowing people and being in the same room with them has, and it's shocking to discover the extent to which members actually don't meet with members of the other party. They used to do it, and there used to be, Secretary, you know what some of those were, but there were sort of systematized, routinized meetings of caucuses, you had lunches, you had...
The Women's Caucus,
Okay, that's a good example.
right? I was
And
a part of that.
maybe now
Well,
with all the
women
women
are
in the
more
Senate.
willing to compromise, and there is quantitative data that shows that. But there's also new research that shows that moderate Republican women are having trouble making their way to office. They are not as often nominated, and they are not as often elected. So more women actually is something that will help.
Well,
But there have to be
President
women on
Faust,
both
that's the
sides of the
answer.
aisle.
More women. We've found the answer here.
We're unanimous on
Yeah, as
that.
you saw, the women played a very important role in bringing this last compromise. And I hope somebody will ask the question, where are we heading now? Dan.
Thanks, Karen. I'm Dan Cunningham. I'm an advanced leadership fellow here at Harvard University this year, and my question is for...
And a small business owner.
And I am a small business owner from the Midwest. And my question is for Professor Skocpol and also Secretary Solis. And I happen to know John Boehner. I'll see him from time to time, and if he's just a regular guy. I agree with you.
Yeah.
And
He's a
but the
Midwesterner.
question is, the data is very clear. Since the 1970s, wages for the average American have not gone up at all by inflation. It's been very flat. And I haven't heard anybody talk about that economic fact in terms of driving this behavior in Congress. I'm interested in your viewpoint on that. And then if there was, and just to take that metric of increasing the wages for the average American, because it hasn't happened in a long time, is that something John Boehner you think would warm up to, both the professor and the secretary? Thank you.
Well, he's been offered opportunities to warm up to it, and he's very carefully prevented them from coming to votes or voted against them. I mean, you know, I do think that the stagnation of family wages for the last 4 decades for the bottom 80% of the population is part of the sense of anxiety and anger out there. But it isn't what drove the grassroots Tea Party. That, there's good, you'd have to read my book to understand, we explored that. And I don't think the problems are just economic, although the inability of the government to function, even on things that most people could work out, has economic consequences. It hasn't helped us to adapt our economy to the new era and promote better wages and opportunities for most Americans, that's for sure.
Well, I'm really concerned that the middle class is diminishing and that we really do need to take a hard look at that. But at the same time, I know that right now in the Congress, we're not going to see a minimum wage bill come up that the president and others are advocating for. And it's going to happen at the local level. And a lot of local jurisdictions can do that. So can state government. You can even put initiatives on the ballot and get them passed that way. That's another alternative. And that's kind of what's happened in California, by the way. But I would also say that it's really, I think, important for people to understand that there's got to be other points of view heard. And I know that there are some reasonable business people, Republicans, who really do want to see some change and would like to see all of us prosper. A good idea that, you know, President Obama stole from the Republicans was, let's put money in infrastructure. Let's repair our roads. Let's repair our schools. Let's repair our bridges.
Very popular
That was a
idea.
Republican idea. The minute that he brings it up, forget it. It's not
Right.
happening.
So there's a lot of room for bipartisanship. Small business was certainly something that got bipartisan support.
Hi, my name is,
support.
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
My name is Will Poff Webster. I'm a senior at the college, and I am a history major. So I'm wondering, we brought in the historical perspective a little bit already, but do you think there's any particular lessons, either culturally or institutionally, we can learn from other periods in American history that have had this significant partisanship that might show the way forward, some way that has happened in the past to get through that, or some way that we've seen that end that might suggest some strategies for the future?
Alex, you have an example of, we're still here, we still have a democracy, we had a lot of problems in the past, how do we get through it?
You know, we've been very lucky, is part of the answer. I mean, I think the issue that we face is, you know, is will this deadlock, will this period of acrimony be self-correcting, okay? Because that's, you know, I mean, in effect, that's what happened in the early 19th century. The Civil War as a whole, I mean, it's a little bizarre to talk about it as self-correcting, but that's what happened in the early 19th century. The institutional configurations in the 30s with the courts took care of themselves. You know, the fact is, if in the 2014 and 2016 elections, things come out looking quite differently, and this deadlock resolves, this is going to look like a little blip. But one of the questions is, can it be self-correcting, or are there the kinds of mechanisms which Professor Skocpol was talking about, which are going to prevent the self-corrections from occurring? And we don't know the answer to that yet, but I think that's what we have to keep our eye on.
I come from a profession whose models say that the self-correction should have already occurred. It's a profession wedded to the median voter model that says that when parties lose elections badly, they move quickly to the middle to recapture majority support. That mechanism has not operated. Now, I'm not saying it won't, but the extremist wing of the Republican Party has to be defeated 3 times in a row. I'm willing to go out on a limb and say 3 times in a row, including in a midterm election when often non-Republicans do not turn out in large numbers, for the forces in the Republican Party that would recapture their party and move it back to the middle to be able to take hold. We have seen things on the left like this where a repositioning had to occur. I don't think they ever went quite as far as we're seeing right now, but we're in for a period of turbulence here, and I don't think this is over yet.
Not over yet, and not over by when January 15, when we come back at it again.
Good evening. My name is Auden Lawrence, and I'm a sophomore at the college. So in the past 5 years, we haven't had a budget passed. There have only been continuing resolutions. And if I had been in the lightning round, I would like to see a budget passed. So I was wondering if there were any suggestions that you all had for reforming the process.
Well, I'll jump on that because that goes right to this whole idea of no budget, no pay. And as I said before, it was used as a short-term solution to a very specific issue that dealt with the debt ceiling. But our idea is to do exactly what you're asking, which is to say that we pass a no budget, no pay piece of legislation that applies to all budget and appropriations that have a deadline. That if and you're right, the consequences of having a continuing resolution just means literally that everything just keeps being shoved down the road. And I think the consequences of that are so deep and so damaging that very thing, if we could just get budgets and real budgets and get them in on time, we would start addressing these very real problems. So I think no budget, no pay would address
You know, it's
exactly
a
the problem
really
you're talking about.
popular idea. I love the idea myself, and I get huzzas every time I mention it in the real world, but they're heavily millionaires. And particularly the ones who are voting to shut down the government are. They're not going to respond to just that. I mean, in a way, it's an insult to the Tea Party forces to suggest that they're all in it for personal gain. I actually think they are, in their own way of thinking of things, principled. And their principles are wrong.
Well, I just say it's
But they're not corrupt.
It's not a principle to not have a budget, and just to put a point on it, you know how difficult it is to beat any incumbent, and we had a hearing in the Senate on no budget, no pay, and Joe Lieberman had a hearing. The Republican who was in charge of the House committee at the time refused to hear it. He didn't like it. In sort of typical, but in arrogant Washington fashion, not only did he not like it, he wouldn't let anybody even talk about it. He wouldn't hold a hearing. And we said, listen, have a hearing, say how much you hate it, that's fine, but just have a public hearing. He refused to do that. On that issue alone, or mostly on that issue, a congressman named Ami Bera from California ran against that incumbent congressman and beat him. So, and that's very much a grassroots issue, and it is a real issue. And I don't care if you're a millionaire or not, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with your obligation and responsibility to pass a budget.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Hotchkiss, and I'm a junior at Harvard College and also a student liaison for Karen Mills. Thank you all for being here. So President Obama has come out and said that the rich need to do their fair share, and for those who are a little less well off, he has created ladders of opportunity and tried to push those kinds of policies. And when Congress has done things like go against him with gun control, he has put in place a few executive actions as like a symbolic gesture against Republican opposition. So my question for the panel is, to what extent do you think the opposition is a symbolic opposition to this president versus a structural opposition to his policy initiatives?
It's a question that we grappled with intensely in our field work with Tea Party people. Because here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there are a lot of people who think Barack Obama is kind of a softie. But in Tea Party land, especially at the grassroots, he's seen as a foreign presence, taking America away from real Americans. And what we heard in people's voices was intense fear of that. So I think there is, and there's another book on the Tea Party done by a scholar out at the University of Washington, Seattle, where it's used the kinds of measures that social psychologists use to get at intensity of ethnic stereotyping and racial stereotyping. And they've found that even compared to other conservatives and other Republicans, Tea Party grassroots people, and remember, this is about half of the voters and the good citizen half that are pressing on many of these Republican legislators. They do hold more severe negative stereotypes. Now, I don't think it helps to slap a label on active citizens, and these are good citizens. But there is something about Obama that has set off a level of fear and counter-mobilization, so that when he is no longer president, there may be a bit less of an edge. But let's not kid ourselves. I mean, William Jefferson Clinton is a good old boy from Arkansas, and he was fiercely opposed on a lot of the same grounds that President Obama has been opposed. And if the next president happens to be Hillary Rodham Clinton, she too will be fiercely opposed by a lot of the same forces.
And you know, if I could just say something, I recall when we were at the State of the Union address, and there was a member of the House that called the president a liar. I think that's the big difference now, when you can insult the president and his title. And I think that to me turns a lot of people off, and I would hope that people, if you get turned off, then put it into action and mobilize, because it's disrespectful. It's also disrespectful of his cabinet members, because I know Karen and I have talked about this. We'd go into hearings, and it was amazing the treatment that we would receive. To me, people that are just not very respectful. There was no decorum, no etiquette. All the rules were out the door, and you were the person to get. And if I could bring you down, I'm going to do everything I can. And that went for some of the cabinet members. And I remember having to face committees that were not friendly and were just diametrically opposed to anything that I was implementing. Green jobs was one of them. There was a big discussion about there are no green jobs. So that whole discussion kind of took its own life, and it was very disturbing. But on the other hand, it also lit a fuel amongst progressives and people that thought, wait a minute, we know this is what needs to happen. And people did get mobilized, and thank goodness that people got activated, but we need to have more of that.
Well, middle-of-the-road Americans are also not on board with this kind of disrespect at all. Not at all. So it's not been popular.
It's a really good question. You know, is it institutional or is it the policies? I'd say it's largely institutional. And there's lots of examples, like immigration was a good one where Republicans should be voting for this. But you know, I remember all those years of all the Democratic Bush love. I mean, I was, you know, so there's equal disparaging of Republicans and Democrats, and I thought it'd be an interesting exercise for somebody to write, to go back and look at the speeches of George Bush in 1999 and Barack Obama in 2007, and compare. And I think if you mixed them up and you grabbed one, you wouldn't be sure who was who, because they were saying the exact same thing, particularly about changing the tone in Washington, bringing people together, exact same thing, and then they both met the sort of partisan tsunami in same and similar and different ways, but the ultimate effect was the same. I mean, Bush had the sort of, you're not a legitimate president because of the Supreme Court. Obama had the birther stuff, sort of different things, but at the end of the day, it was like Democrats were saying Bush is not legitimate, Republicans saying Obama's not legitimate. So I think you're right. It's an institutional kind of reflex, which is really bad and hopeful and not fair and not right. It is what it is, and you know, hopefully, you know, I think it's in part a sign of our times. It's in part because of who they were, but maybe new leadership will be able to leach some of that poison out of the water.
No Democrat stood up and called George Bush.
Oh, I don't agree.
liar.
In
the middle of a State of the Union
No, I know.
address. No, and it really does matter.
I'm the one that stood up and gave Joe Wilson money. I mean, his opponent when that happened. Okay, so yes, I get that.
No, but
my point is,
there's also a clear difference. There certainly are crazy extremists on both ends of the spectrum.
Right, that's the only point I'm trying to make.
But there's a big difference when public leadership figures in the political party and office holders both echo and encourage the craziest elements.
I agree.
And while that may have happened in the Democratic Party back in the 80s, it did not happen under George W. Bush. So there's a difference.
So we have time for a last question.
My name is Ben Bolger, and I'm an alum of Harvard. Some people have talked about the importance of campaign finance reform. Others have talked about the need to improve civic education in grade school and high school to encourage more voting behavior. I'm wondering if the panel has any thoughts or have any reasons to be optimistic about encouraging more voter turnout, especially in the primaries, which seem to be increasingly radicalized of recent. Is there any hope for more broad mainstream voters to be engaged in the process of picking candidates, which are very important?
I think one positive development on that front is what we call the jungle primary, which they do in Louisiana, and I think they're starting to do in California, where it's really not where you have a primary, but the primary is not within the parties. It's just a general primary where the top two vote getters then run off. So you could have, so Republicans, everybody runs together, and you could have two Democrats run off against each other or two Republicans run off against each other. I think that's maybe part of it, the solution.
I don't know about that. We had a terrible race in California where two members that had pretty much identical backgrounds in terms of their philosophies, two Democrats, spent like $7 million. And boy, oh boy, let me tell you, a lot of people were really upset about that.
You know, I mean, I don't think, go ahead.
I just wanted to come in on the question of turnout, because it relates to other issues that we've talked about. Turnout is, in American elections, less so in primaries, but in general, is quite good in the middle class and the upper middle class. It's among poor people and in the working class the turnout is very low. There's, you know, many political scientists and historians have made their living trying to interpret that. But there certainly seems to be a lot of evidence that part of it is that working class people and poor people don't see that there's much in it for them either way. And frankly, I don't think you're going to get an increase in turnout until that changes and until they really do see that it will really matter to them. Now, one fringe benefit, I think, of what the Republican Party has been doing is that it's actually been making the case that that there is a difference between the parties. And maybe that will boost some of this.
And it has already. I mean, minority and youth turnout has gone up in the last two presidential elections. And for example, in the Virginia election that just occurred, turnout was low, as it often is in these. This is kind of off year in Virginia because they don't even. It's not even. But black turnout was high, and it's probably related to the fact that the black community is supportive of Obama, but also because there's a perception in many minority communities that efforts are being made to discourage their vote. And we saw those long, long lines in the last election of people, even 90-year-old minority women standing in long lines to make sure that their vote wasn't taken away from them. So there is a counter reaction, and that's part of it. Now, I have to say, I don't think procedural fixes, I am a historical social scientist, and I'll tell you that there have been one reform movement after another in this country that has thought that had some procedural fixes, you know, change the way something, referendum or election, or have no labels, or have independence, and it always backfires.
You might need the last word.
And in the state of Maine, where I spend a lot of time, I love the state of Maine. But you know, they ended up with a Tea Party governor who says crazy things, and who the state doesn't fit the state's style, and is deeply unpopular. And how did that happen? It happened because independents run in Maine, and the crazy Republican governor got elected with 37% of the vote. So one has to be very careful when trying to build up these alternatives in the middle. The American institutional system does not make it easy for a separate party to make headway.
Last word, Mike.
Well, that's for sure, and I was familiar with the Americans Elect experiment last time. But I mean, I think I would agree with your point, which is, you know, these process fixes aren't going to be except around the edges, aren't going to dial up or down voter turnout in any significant way. But I would say that on the issue that we kind of touched on here toward the end, which is economic income disparity, that to me is something that is a huge problem, a growing problem, one in which, you know, you really are pitting sort of classes against each other, and that's where you could get a real kind of revolution from the streets. And something that, I mean, it's going to be that sort of thing that creates a huge dynamic shift in turnout. I think when people are really saying, I'm getting screwed, and we're rising up. So,
on that note, please join me in thanking the President, President Faust, for convening us here and this fabulous panel. Thank you so much for being here.
And good questions. Good questions. From,
excellent questions.
Well done.
Thank you all.
Very good.
nicely done.
What was interesting that we ended up